Hello there, Agile Crab Rangoons, and welcome to another episode of Agile Bytes. It's the podcast sponsored by Integrity Inspired Solutions, where we're building software in an agile manner day in and day out. I've kind of staggered these out, but over the past several weeks, I've been doing podcasts that are specifically about the theory of constraints. And in the theory of constraints, there are 5 focusing questions when we're talking about dealing with a constraint. And I've already done episodes specifically around the first 3. Just to refresh your memory, even though I know all of you have listened to every episode and you remember them all faithfully, let's just pretend this is more for my benefit than for your benefit. So the first focusing step is identifying the constraint. So we did an episode on how to find your constraint. The second focusing step is on optimizing your constraint. This is where you are making sure your constraint is doing everything it can as well as it can. So whatever you've got to work with, you're working the best you can with that. And then we did an episode on subordinating to the constraint. What does it mean for all the other stages in your value stream to work around the constraint to fully support the constraint? So go back and listen to those episodes if you haven't. I would encourage you to do that because it's important as you go through this process that you don't skip any of the steps. A lot of times people skip right to the step that we're going to be talking about in today's episode, which is elevating the constraint or increasing the constraint's capacity. But you don't want to skip any of those others. Some people jump right to this step without even figuring out what your constraint actually is, or what's the best way to get the most efficiency out of the constraint you've got without doing a lot of additional things. In the book, The Goal by Eli Goldratt, which is a fine book that I recommend to all of you, in one of the appendices, they interview Dr. Antoine van Gelder, and it's about how the theory of constraints applied to a medical practice. So in this practice, the constraints were the actual doctors, because they're the specialists, right? They're the ones that have the highly prized skill set. They are the ones doing the appointments. There's a limited amount of people they can see throughout the day. So the doctors and those visits are the constraint. Now, if you jump straight to elevating the constraint, which is basically increasing the capacity of your constraint, allowing it to do more work, how would you solve that problem? Well, probably the most intuitive thing to do would be to hire more doctors. Right? If you've got more patients coming in than your doctors can effectively service, you don't want to start turning patients away, so you start hiring more doctors. But instead, they went through the steps in sequence, and they discovered that one of the things that the doctors were doing was dealing with missed appointments. They were making sure that the patients were going to be there, and if the patients missed their appointments, then that capacity that the doctors had went unused. And what they discovered then is if they gave more attention to confirming appointments, then that would help with this problem. So what they did is they hired people to just confirm appointments and be diligent about that. The number of missed appointments went way down, and now the doctors were actually able to service more people, not because they added to the number of doctors or increased the ability of the doctors to do anything. They just took out the missed appointments. They just reduced that. So by focusing on optimizing the constraint that they had within the boundaries of what they currently had, they got a lot of mileage out of that without having to add more doctors, which obviously would be expensive and that sort of thing. So don't skip steps, because you may get some big improvements in your ability to deliver by going through the previous steps and not really have to acquire anything new at all, and in many times not even spend any money. So there is a little bit of overlap between the optimizing step and the elevating step. The key thing to remember about them is with the optimizing step, we're trying to take what we've got and get the most out of it. We're not trying to add new things, hire new people, buy new machinery. We're just trying to take what we've got and get as much out of it as we can. We're increasing the efficiency of what we've got. Elevating the constraint means now we are actually adding capacity to the constraint. We are allowing the constraint to be able to do more. So for example, if I run a pottery shop and I've got an oven that dries 20 pots at once, I can optimize my processes. There's things I can do to get as much out of that oven as I can. But at the end of the day, I can only do 20 pots at once, no matter what I do. So the only way to be able to truly get more pots, assuming that I've optimized everything, is to get a bigger oven, right? Or get 2 ovens or something like that. So that's what we're talking about with the elevating step. We've done everything we can to optimize what we've got. We've got all the stages subordinate to what the constraint can put through. So now we're ready to look at the constraint and be like, okay, how can we actually add more? How can we increase the amount of things that this optimized constraint is actually going to do? And I'm going to give you some ideas. Some of these will be more applicable to your situation than others, but it's to kind of get you thinking. One thing that people usually want to do in this step, if you haven't started doing it before, is to be meticulous about tracking all the things that are going on with your constraint. Now, I will say this, especially when we're talking about software teams, you have to be very clear to people on these teams that the reason that you're tracking things is because you are trying to look for things to take off of their plate. You're trying to look for ways to make their workload easier. You have to be very clear that your tracking is not to make sure that they are performing. It's not a performance metric that they're being measured by. It's not to make sure people stay busy. This is how most developer teams experience the use of metrics. So it's a psychological hurdle that you need to overcome. You need to have a very open and transparent conversation about it because people will think it if you don't say otherwise. But what these metrics are for is for figuring out what are the things that are making the life of the constraint more difficult. What are the things that makes the work slower? What are the things that are keeping them from being able to do as much work as they can? I'll tell you a quick story. When I was a baby consultant, which means I was early in my consultant career, I did not consult for babies knowingly. But when I was a baby consultant, talking with one of the development teams, we were taking a look at, what is it that's really delaying us? What are some of our big holdups in production? And something they said was it was changing requirements. They said the users are constantly changing their requirements, but nobody is adjusting the expectations for delivery. So, we might have something that we thought would be done at the end of the week or the end of the month, but then users start changing their minds, but they don't change their expectations. So now we have to go back and rework things or add new features or whatever. And they're still expecting this all to get done within the same time frame. And I was like, okay, well, let's start out by measuring. Every time somebody has a change, let's track where it came from. And we did. Come to find out that 2/3 of the changes came from the developers themselves. The users were actually the minimum source of changes. It was actually the developers. They would be working on something and then they would think, oh, you know what, while we're here, we should do this, that, and the other thing. Or, yeah, they asked us to put first name and last name on this form, but we should also go ahead and put in prefix, suffix, and middle initial because they're probably going to want that. There's all this gold plating and various things. And so one of the things we did was before we decide to improve on what the users asked, let's bare minimum take these ideas back to them for prioritization. And once we got that off of our plates, then we were able to deliver a lot more quickly. So the team needs to realize that these are the kinds of things the metrics are for. It's to see where's all of our time going. You might discover that your developer team spends a ton of time in meetings. Well, what if we could reduce those meetings? Or what if someone else could attend those meetings on their behalf and be their voice or carry back the relevant information to them? When you're in a realm when you're trying to elevate the constraint, doing these little metrics experiments becomes very important. You're not going to do these metrics for the entire lifespan of the team, but they're temporary things so you can kind of get your arms around the things that you will need to add to or improve or work on to increase the constraint's ability to have throughput, and just make sure they understand it's not a performance metric. It's not to make sure that they're busy. We also want to make sure that we are doing the best job we can with quality control before, during, and after the constraint. Make sure that by the time your constraint gets work, that it is ready to go. So I always tell my developers, when you say that something is ready for QA to take a look at, as far as you know, we should be able to deploy it in production. That's how confident you should feel. Like this is ready to go to production. QA is just a formality. They're just going to put a rubber stamp on it and we're going to move it right through. That's how good this should be before QA takes a look at it. Why? Because a lot of times QA is the constraint when we're working with clients and they have their own QA department, especially. So we want to make sure that QA is not spending their time just making sure the features work, right? QA should be making sure that things that normal people would not think of are handled gracefully by the software. Usage patterns, data patterns, things that developers are not going to think of, or even that the users themselves might not think of right away. Hacks that users might generate to get things done because the UI, UX isn't maybe up to par where it needs to be. We want QA to be spending their time doing that. Edge cases, weird things, breaking things that no one's going to think about. We don't want them spending the vast majority of their time just making sure the thing works. Okay, we want to make sure it's as bulletproof as we can make it. By the time it gets to them, they should be finding those kinds of things, not just verifying that things work. So that's just one example. We want to make sure quality control is solid. By the time the constraint gets things, we want to get all rework off of their plate. We don't want them to spend time chasing people down to ask questions. We don't want them clarifying things that are unclear on a regular basis. We want to make sure we're taking care of all of that. In fact, when we're building software, I highly encourage you to think about how you can build quality control and quality reporting measures into the actual product. Logging is one example of this, but there's all kinds of instrumentation and things like that that you can build into your product to let you know ahead of time that there's going to be a quality issue. Another thing that you can do, and not a lot of places think about this right off the bat, is equipment upgrades. Whoever's working in the area that you're constrained, what's their equipment like? Are they using good computers with good processors, or do they have the oldest computers in your organization? That could be a way that you could increase your constraints capacity for throughput without having to necessarily hire more people. Make sure their equipment is good. Make sure their equipment doesn't die. Make sure they have backups. Make sure they can keep working. Get them faster processors, do whatever. Take a look at that. Of course, one option is always to add more people. This is what the idea people usually jump to at first, and that is a way to do it. Let's take, for instance, QA being the constraint. If they're the constraint and we need to increase the constraint's ability to move work through, one easy way to do that is to add more people. And that works. But just keep in mind that when you add more people, that is going to be expensive. There's also going to be a period where those people will probably actually reduce the constraint's ability to move work through because they have to learn the job and they have to be trained and they have to be corrected and they have to be helped a lot. Now, that's an investment we always have to make with hiring new people. We all know this. So don't shy away from it, but just keep it in mind, right? If your project is in trouble, that is not the right time to add more people to the constraint. You're actually going to slow yourself down at the time when throughput is the most critical. So that's not the right time to add people. But as you're looking at your delivery patterns over time, once you've identified the constraint, one very straightforward way to increase the capacity is simply to add more people. Just keep in mind that's probably also your most expensive option, and you are going to have that investment time where your constraints capacity could potentially drop. Obviously, when we're talking about machines, it doesn't always work that way, right? If you've got a machine with a certain capacity and you buy another machine, or you buy a machine with a bigger capacity, that's probably just gonna work most of the time. So let's not conflate people with machines really in any context. But one thing I do want to draw your attention to that people don't always think about is I want you to think about the policies that the constraint has to operate under. Think about the rules and the workflow practices that you are requiring that group to work under. Now, some of these, obviously, we don't have a lot of control over. There are regulatory compliance issues that we have to accommodate. But even in those areas, sometimes we accommodate regulatory issues with a lot more process and fanfare than we need to comply with the actual letter of the law. So one of the things you can do to elevate your constraint is just do a good, thorough review of how are we doing things? Why are we doing it? Is it necessary to do things this way? One example, I was helping an international reinsurance company plan one of their products. And we had everybody in the room. We were coming up with the first MVP, and there's a specific workshop that I take clients through to get them to an MVP. And we had everybody involved in the total end-to-end business process in the room talking about it. And then we were putting features on a storyboard. We were mapping out the user journeys. And then somebody said, "Oh, you forgot the 15-page checklist we do at the end." And everyone kind of started looking at each other like, what are you talking about? So these were underwriting assistants. And they said, yeah, before we issue a quote, we have to fill out a 15-page checklist to make sure everything is good. Nobody else in the room was even aware this checklist existed. Certainly nobody was looking at it. We had people who were experts in the regulatory compliance aspect in the room. They had never heard of such a thing. So just think about this. As part of the normal workflow process, somebody, these underwriting assistants, were having to go through a 15-page checklist every single time. Do you think that constrained the throughput of that group? It absolutely did. And we removed that constraint not by building cool software around it, but by eliminating that step altogether. Nobody cared. It wasn't used. It wasn't a legal issue. Maybe at one point it was, but it wasn't now. And it was just an artifact of the past that was in the business process. We made the quote generation process hours and hours faster, not by building software, but by eliminating a step that didn't need to be there. So examining the policies around the way your group operates can be a great way to elevate the constraint and get more throughput out of your constraint simply by loosening up where you don't need to be so tight, eliminating things that don't need to be there, or adopting workflow policies that are more suited to the kind of work that the constraint is actually doing. So take a good long look at that, reevaluating the processes that limit the throughput of your constraint. Now, before I go, those are all some suggestions. I'm sure that has got your gears turning and you're thinking of more that specifically apply to your situation, and that's great. But I want to leave you with one parting thought that may be counterintuitive at first. You may want to keep the constraint as the constraint. See, sometimes when people get into the theory of constraints, they have this idea that the idea is to make your constraint so productive that it is no longer the constraint. It's no longer the chief bottleneck, and the constraint moves. And it is true that the next step is to find the next constraint. However, I would throw out there that the goal here is not to make the constraint not the constraint anymore. The goal is just making sure that when you are improving the system, you are getting the biggest bang for your buck, which is why we are focused so much on the constraint, because any improvements we make there are going to give us exponential returns as opposed to improving something that doesn't really affect our throughput at all. So that's really what we're about. We're not trying to make the constraint not the constraint anymore. In fact, there are good reasons why you may want to purposefully keep the constraint as the constraint. One reason is it is often cost prohibitive to increase the capacity of the constraint very much. Okay, like I said, as soon as we hire a new doctor, that's a big expense, right? As soon as we hire more developers, that's a big expense, and there's all kinds of other costs associated with it. It may make economic sense not to really make your constraint that much better. We want it to be as good as it possibly can be, but if we start increasing the capacity so that it's not the constraint anymore, we may be pouring a ton of time and money into that, and the return that we get out of increasing the capacity just might not be worth it, or it just isn't worth it right now. The other thing is, think of all the work we've had to do to optimize the system around the constraint, right? With not just optimizing the constraint and elevating the constraint, but also subordinating the rest of the system. And even finding the constraint is an exercise in time management, right? Imagine if your constraint hopped around all the time. You would have to keep doing this over and over and over again and keep changing your system to adapt to whatever the new constraint is. Now, for some teams, that's great. That's not a problem. In fact, maybe that's your ideal situation. So I'm not telling you not to do that. I am just trying to make you aware that there is some overhead involved in doing that. And so what some companies choose to do is, instead of working on the constraint until it isn't the constraint anymore, instead they purposefully decide where they want the constraint to be so that they always know where it is, and they can always plan around it, and they can have a nice stable system that they can work off of and get metrics off of and things like that. So it is something to consider whether you actually want the constraint to improve past the point of it being the constraint, or whether you want to keep it where it is. It's just something you want to think about as you go. But you can always improve the capacity of your constraint. We just don't know if we want to make it so that it's not the constraint anymore. That's just a conscious decision you need to make. So I hope these ideas give you some food for thought. Okay, keep in mind what we're trying to do at this stage is take your constraint and add to its ability to do work. We've talked about tracking metrics to see where the time is going, making sure quality control is good. We talked about upgrading equipment, hiring more people, and especially changing policies that might be limiting your constraint. And if you do these kinds of things, I think you will see the capacity of your constraint grow. And when that happens, your whole system is going to get exponential upgrades to your delivery. Thanks everyone for listening to Agile Bites. Agile does sometimes bite, but we don't think it always has to. If you enjoyed what you heard today, don't forget to like and subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you happen to be using. And if you can, leave us a comment because we'd love to hear your feedback. What things would you like to hear about? What things did you hear that were valuable to you today? You can also head over to integrityinspired.com to sign up to our email list. But that's all for today, folks. We'll see you next time.